Welcome to Learn Software Architecture channel, where you can learn about different software architecture topics from regular episodes as well as from live interview with my guests. And today's guest is Oskar Dudycz, an engineer with more than 15 years of experience who runs workshops and helps companies to better understand topics around event-driven architecture, a speaker at the biggest IT conferences around the world, and the former maintainer of Marten and founder of Emmett, a Node.js library taking your event-driven applications back to the future. I really like it. We can all agree that when you think of event sourcing, you see Oskar. And what else could we talk about but this? We will discuss all the basics you need to know when talking about event sourcing, how to start, what to be aware of, what the trade-offs are and potential benefits, and much more. Hello, Oskar.
Hey, thank you for the great introduction. I'm almost blushed after that, but yeah, thank you for invitation. Happy to be here. I hope that we will be able to entangle some misconception and clarify some stuff around event sourcing.
That's the goal. That's the goal. And guys, just to let you know, you can ask any question during this live interview. And when we will find time during the interview, we would like to answer it. So don't wait till the end. You can do that immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So before we start, I want you to say, Oskar, something about yourself. How did you start your journey with programming?
I think that I was lazy. uh, for I mean, I always like to play games. I like computers, especially my Amiga 500. Yes, I'm that old, Amiga 500 old. And but I also liked other stuff like playing football, reading books, etc. But science and math was quite easy for me in terms that I didn't need to memorize a lot of stuff. So it was for me more like an obvious choice to just follow what I felt that are my, uh, I wouldn't say that strong skills, but some skills. I liked other things, but that was probably the easiest for me. So I was lazy. But so I didn't start as a passionate around programming, etc. But in the meantime, I became quite passionate. As I was doing more and more, I realized that it's a really fun, not always, but most of the time, it's a lot of fun to solve those riddles, programming riddles, etc. And definitely, I like to see the outcome of my work. So being able to, tell computer what it has to be doing, and that then your software can help other people, that's definitely motivating.
Okay, so you are one of these guys who started quite early with the programming journey, let's say.
Uh, Hard to say. It depends how you count it. I started with there was a when I was young. I will sound like a boomer, but sorry.
You are
My
not that young
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah. My first time when I was programming was when I was on the um, early elementary school, because my colleague had a book, and at that time at Commodore 64 you can rewrite the content of the book like a real book into the computer, and then you would get like a simple text RPG game. So that was my goal with my first time with programming. But then I played games till the high school. So at the end of the high school, I think I started to do more programming.
You know, I think I have heard already this story somewhere, someone, and not from you, about this book that someone was using it and rewriting the content of it to just run something on Commodore. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, cool, cool, cool story. I started my journey in high school. So from C++, I remember still there was a program called Dev C++, and this is how I started. So it was quite late in the game, but still, I think I started when I was 17.
Yeah. Fun fact is that I started programming with Macromedia Flash, not yet even Adobe Flash, and it was really nice to. It was relatively easy to make some fun games or animation, etc. So you immediately saw the outcome of your work. So I'm probably one of 2 or 3 people that enjoyed programming in Flash.
I had one colleague in my high school who enjoyed.
Yeah.
Maybe he was the second one.
Yeah.
Okay. I think now it's time to get more specific about today's topic. And for starting point, I would like to ask you, what is event sourcing? How would you define it? And why should I even consider using it as a programmer?
So there are multiple definitions of the event sourcing, and I don't think that there is a single one canonical. So maybe let's start with trivializing a bit event sourcing. So what it is, in a nutshell, it's a storage pattern. So if you'd like to think about event sourcing, then I would put it in the same type of boxes as relational databases or relational approach, document-based approach. And event sourcing is an event-driven approach. And event stores are databases. They're not a messaging queues. So Kafka is not an event store, sorry. But what they are. So I think that for me works the best explanation that event stores are specific type of databases, key value databases, where key is the record ID and value is the sequence of events. So all the events that were recorded for this specific record. Simple as that. So you can think about it like, if you're using, you can use any type of storage. It can be natively built like EventStoreDB. It might use Postgres as Marten, or you can think about it following this logical explanation. I mean, logical definition of event store, that if you're using, for example, MongoDB, then you would put just all of the events inside the document. And so that's quite trivializing, because then, okay, why should I use a different storage pattern? Someone could ask. And the power of the event sourcing is that, and the best way to use it is when you are able to talk with your business experts, domain experts, or in general, if you are able to model your business processes. They don't need to be like extremely sophisticated or complicated. For a long time, event sourcing was shown as the highest level of enlightenment, so that you started with DDD, and then maybe in the future you would use event sourcing. I disagree with such take, because event sourcing, as I mentioned, from the basic rules, it's not a hard pattern, because each time you append, you run the business operation, then you append new event to the stream at the end of a stream. So to this record, this sequence of event for the particular record. And when you are reading data, then you need to read all the events and then build the local representation. And because those events are representing both the business concepts, so for instance, invoice issued, reservation confirmed, order initiated, shipment completed, all the parts or the critical parts of your business flow, then for me at least, it's much easier to reason and understand, because documentation as code is glorified nowadays as the best way to tackle stuff. But indeed, it's really hard to get document your business process inside of code, because those are totally different environments. But in event sourcing, it's getting a bit easier to do it, because you need to to be able to store those events. Then first you need to find those events, and by that you are kind of forced, in a good or bad way, depending how you look on that, to think about your business process, and at least do basic modeling. Because if we are using the traditional way, then we are treating quite often our tables or document collections as just bugs for data. Here, you cannot do it this way, because it will be much harder. I talked with one friend, and we agreed recently that event sourcing extrapolates good habits and bad habits. So if you're doing stuff well, then with event sourcing, you will be doing that even better. You will get a great synergy. But if you try to follow the classical approach and don't think about the business, then you will have a really much hard time with that.
You mentioned several times events, and
Hmm.
event is, of course, integral part of the name of event
Hmm.
sourcing. How does such event look like?
Hmm. So maybe start with the digression. So for it's surprising, but for us developers, it's harder to understand what's event, because we immediately think about the event as mouse button clicked, or some user selected in the combo box, or maybe some purely technical event that is happening. Um, when I was working with the business people, then they are immediately trying to and getting the idea about the event. And what's that idea? Event is a fact about something that has happened in your business process. So I'm quite often talking that events are like a critical parts of your business process. So then the popularity of methodologies like event storming is also helping, because you can use and talk with the business and reflect that parts. So events, so answering your question, then events, from like the general standpoint, they represent something that happened in your business. So as I mentioned, issue, invoice, sorry, invoice
Invoice
issued,
issue. Mhm.
etc. And the important part is that they should be named in a past tense, because events represent something that has happened, and you cannot change the past, at least if you don't have DeLorean. Um, uh, so typically events you can either accept, so you get the information, uh, for example, that like recently we had elections in our local governments, and you might be happy about that, you might not, but you need to accept that fact. So also events, they are facts in the sense that they are gathering a specific information. They are also messages, type of messages. And that's really powerful, because you can interpret the same fact in a many different ways. So for instance, if you have a football game and one team won, then people that are so supporters, fans of this team, will be extremely happy, and the other team would be rather sad. So I would say that this is more or less what are the events. And in code, technically, events are usually represented by some immutable structure, like in C# or Java, they can be records. In TypeScript, then they can be read-only types. So in general, they are like a simple plain messages. They should not have any logic, etc. They just gather some information about business fact that happened in our system.
Okay, so first of all, we have a business fact. Event represents a business fact, and in code, it should be represented by immutable type. So these are
Yeah.
two very important things here to
Yep.
remember.
Yep. and they
Martin,
should
right?
be named rather not like a created, updated, deleted, because then we have crowdsourcing instead of event sourcing. So they should be as close as possible to the uh, business terminology, because then we can get this synergy between business and technical solution.
Yeah. Yeah, especially updated. This is something that is quite often used, and that's the one which is really problematic, because sometimes you are just updating something in your sheet, and it can be a notebook or something like that. So you are just updating your notes.
Yeah,
This is something which is often causing me a headache, this update.
indeed.
Martin writes that talking about events as developers, those delegates flashbacks. Yeah. Yeah, this is something that I notice every single time when I run event storming workshops, that when I run it with, let's say, audience which is more into the business, then these are the business events. If I run these workshops with developers, it's usually more in this, what you mentioned, button clicked, report generated, and so on and so on. And I think it's really important to find this balance between both. And as you mentioned, for event sourcing, such fact that button was clicked probably makes no sense and
Yeah.
no meaningful information. Okay, cool. And let me say that, imagine that today I am a developer and I store the data as a single row in a relational database. This data is related to product quantity, deliveries, shipment, and so on. Each time I update my row representing a product, so I always have the current state when I read it. Is there any danger? And if so, can event sourcing help me?
So what is the main challenge that you have right now? Let's say. So could you maybe
The main challenge,
rephrase it? Yeah, like
yes.
for that developer, let's say.
Okay. The challenge of this developer is that it's so hard to always remember to update one entry. And then after it's updated, it's so hard to track the history of it. So I have another tables where I try to store the facts about this updates, but then it's very hard to get all of them and, let's say, calculate quantity, calculate how many deliveries were done with this product and so on. And in this case, can I switch to event sourcing? Can it help me somehow?
Yeah. So yes, definitely you can, but you might not need event sourcing. But let's start with why event sourcing could help you. Because as you said, if we are using relational database, then quite often our tables are related to each other with the foreign keys, etc. And we have this usually a tree structure of those data. So for instance, we have a shopping cart with a product items, or we have a school class with a list of pupils, etc. But if you look on the on the specific table, and you would like to understand just by looking at the data what happened in your system, then as you said, you will have a hard time trying to understand and correlate data between multiple tables. Some people, and I also did that in past, are trying to solve it by introducing the historical tables. But then again, those historical tables or change detection capture, you always need to set up it for a specific column. So even if you get this delta, then you don't know, like, because they are representing just what has changed and in a specific table. So it's really hard to get what precisely has happened, and that's critical if you try to trace your the bug either from like a technical that you realize, or maybe what's worse, the customer that is telling you that, for instance, the quote is not calculated correctly. So what event sourcing could help you in that, because in event sourcing, we are not thinking immediately about the storage, because the storage is extremely simple. Like, it can be represented as a single big table where you are just appending new event and you have a stream ID column. And the power of that, of this simplicity, is that you can put in the event data all of the information representing precisely what has happened. So, for instance, if you are opening shopping cart, then you will have some information about the client, when you opened, etc. But you won't have information about the product. And if you are adding the products, then you don't need to repeat information about the client, etc., because you already recorded it in the first event on the stream. And then you still not losing the capability of reading the data, as you mentioned, as you were before, because in event sourcing, you have something that is called projection. And projection, I'm calling that this is another interpretation of the events. So technically, event stores can notify you about the new events that were recorded. And you can take those events and store it and maintain the current state in some row of your shopping cart, or in like reservation, etc. So you don't need to query, for instance, if you want to see the list of the reservations or list of users, then you don't need to query all the events that were recorded for those reservation or users. You can project, so update and build the read models that are dedicated and fine-tuned and optimized for the reading needs, and just query them as you were before. So
this is one of my questions as well, because imagine that we have a system, maybe product, let's leave the product besides, but let's say we have some stock exchange application. And then there are so many events which are related to some kind of index that at some point we might operate on millions of events that we stored for this particular case, for this particular index. And what then with performance? How to deal with performance? Is there anything else than projection? Can you use something else?
So if you want to be really performant, then my recommendation would be to have the data stored into the database durable. But if you don't need a sophisticated performance, or maybe if you have not a lot of data to process, then you can also store that information like in memory. So instead of storing the result in the relational database or document database, then you can just keep it in memory, and then reading from that will be fast. But if you need to start up your system, then you need to build those projections. So that's a trade-off. So it's either you are optimizing for the fast reads, but then you need to either have a huge memory amount of in your service to be able to keep it all in memory, or you are storing that in the database. But from my perspective, like the databases nowadays are so fast that and I think that you also told that in your talks, that really they can take a lot, and it's not easy to for example, make Postgres kneel and be don't work nice. So but yeah, there are plenty of options where to keep it and how to keep it. You can keep it on Redis, or you can have like both. So you can have storing that in database, and for those that are accessed the most often, then keep them in some second level of cache, like in memory or in Redis. And I'm not a huge fan of caching, but event sourcing is great for caching because it's predictable. because you have all the facts recorder, all the events. So if you have the same mechanism for building those projections, like even those in memory, then it will be always the same. And if you want append new event, then it's also easier to track what you need to update and what you need to invalidate.
Have you ever used cache in projects that were using event sourcing? I mean, in commercial product or not?
Yeah, so yes and no. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to avoid using caching early in the project phase. So I'm using cache when I know what's the really domain and what are the usage patterns. Because if I start to cache too early, then as we all know, you will get all the nasty issues that you can imagine. But for instance, even StoreDB, if you are using the HTTP protocol, and this HTTP protocol is a bit obsolete right now, but they have a really aggressive caching of the HTTP level. So because if you are reading events through this built-in HTTP API, then those events will be always the same. Like they won't change. So you can easily cache those events in memory and just append new stuff into the cache, because it will this is the one of the advantages of the immutable data, that it just append only, so it's extremely easy to cache.
Yeah. And absolutely, I agree with you that if you don't have problems in your project, then just add cache.
Yeah, then you have one more problem than you had before.
Or your first problem, yes, if you
Yeah.
think about it. Yeah. And as you mentioned, I am with you with that. You can store enormous amount of data in databases, and you can play around with that. You can play with these replicas for reading, for example, or if you want to optimize writes, you can use sharding concept or whatever, and then you can think about cache. So I am with you on this topic, absolutely. And I would like to ask you about one more thing, because you mentioned projections, but there is often in discussions about event sourcing, there is a concept of snapshots. Can you tell me something about this snapshots?
See, I was doing my best to avoid this topic.
And that's a very good input from your side, because then it's interesting.
Yeah. So maybe let's tell what are the snapshots. So if you so quite often people are afraid that if you will be storing a lot of events inside your streams, then if you need to load them constantly, all the events to build the local state to run your business logic against that, then it will be too slow. But then, of course, if you ask that person what does that mean, too slow, then usually it's well, I don't know, but it can be too slow, so maybe let's optimize that from the beginning. So people are trying to store the local representation, like the state that they build in memory in events, to keep them also in some separate storage. So for instance, if you're using Marten, then you can store it also in the same database. But if you're using even StoreDB, then you can either store those snapshots as events or in other databases, etc. No matter where you store it, then snapshots can be valid pattern, but also they are some sort of caching. So we are trying, if you're thinking about it as a performance optimization, and you know that you just don't have any idea how to make it faster, and you know that your functionality needs to be fast, then of course it's fine to store additionally those frozen state of your stream in some database and read it. Then typically it's like, besides the data, you are also storing the version at which you store this snapshot. So by version, I mean that if it's if it was like fourth event, then version will be fourth. If 5 events, then 5, etc. And then when you are reading the data, then you start with reading snapshot, getting the version at which it was taken, and reading those events that happen after that. So then you have the performance optimization. But if snapshots are cached, then you will have all the nasty issues that you might have with a cache. So the cache invalidation is the obvious reason. It's hard to say like how often it's enough to do the snapshot. Usually, if you're doing snapshot, then that means that either you believe or you have the real need to make it performant. So if we stick to this e-commerce, then that means that it's really critical functionality for you, or at least you think that it is. And usually those performance critical are getting the biggest demand. And for instance, if you have Black Friday, then it might appear that, for instance, you didn't get the proper cache invalidation strategy, and then you might have a ripple effect because you didn't spend enough time optimizing your initial model and working on modeling. And when cache invalidated, then you have like 10,000 of events in the stream. I had cases where people call me and say like, yeah, 2 weeks ago it was good enough, but now we reached the number of events and it's not good enough anymore. What can we do? Or or the record, one of the event store DB clients users, they were keeping 160 millions of events in one stream, but that's an aberration, so don't recommend that. But getting back to the snapshots, then the other aspect besides cache invalidation is that, as I mentioned, you ignore the modeling practices because you are just treating events store as some additional storage where you keep your log, your history. And that can be fine if it's a conscious decision. But if it's an accidental decision because you wanted to do event sourcing, but you fall into the trap of using snapshots as a default design choice, then you might realize that, for instance, if you want to update your right model because you want to change how the business flow looks like, you might realize that you were lazy, just like me selecting the school to go to become the programmer, and you were lazy enough to reuse your right model as read model, and then you are changing your right model to fulfill better your business logic needs, and then it appears that immediately you broke your reading side, etc. So you have like this fight of the powers where so you are getting back to the initial issues and initial design and the initial challenges that you had in the traditional way, and you wanted to avoid them by going to event sourcing, but then you are going back to precisely the same stuff. So then the question, how to migrate snapshots, how to invalidate them, what to do. And so
a lot of problems.
yeah, I would say that snapshots can be a fine choice for advanced event sourced users, but not for the beginners. And the fun fact is that typically it's not used too often by the experienced people, but it's used quite often for beginners. So the other way around than it should be. But of course, I'm not blaming anyone. This is just a learning curve. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend using snapshots as a default choice.
It might be related to a big mess, I think, which is around event sourcing nowadays. I know that you are trying to tackle it down and you write great articles and so on. But in general, in all the discussions that I observe, it's always like event sourcing is really complex. You need to think about a lot of different components, this snapshots, projections, and so on. And in the end, based on what you say, it's just event store to store the events and some read model to read these events.
Yes.
And that's it.
Yeah. And if you use tools like Marten, then you can combine both in the same database. So that's also an option. And it's not that you will need to face immediately um, the eventual consistency. If you're using relational database as your storage engine, then
Mhm.
why to end up with the lowest common denominator? Why not to use the strong uh, sides of the storage that you have? So you can still, like, for instance, if you want to update read model, then in Marten we were doing that, and that we are opening transaction when we are appending event, selecting all the projections, so functions, how to transform event and your current state into the new state, and storing and updating the read model in the same transaction. And that can take you pretty far, that approach. Of course, you should not be afraid of eventual consistency. It's not that scary as it's pictured,
Mhm.
but uh, it's some mental challenge and another step on the learning process. So I always recommend to do it step by step, so you can do it. So as you said, it's not technically, it's really simple pattern, but I think that the biggest challenge, besides the misconception done, for example, around event streaming and event sourcing, etc., the number of potential integrations and what you can do with events, that can be overwhelming. But then, is it something to blame event sourcing that it has many options and enable and give you more options? I wouldn't say that it's a downside. It can be seen as such, and I fully understand that. But it's like blaming someone that that person can do a lot of stuff. Yeah, okay, is it an issue? Depending how you look on that.
If you use your knowledge wisely, then it's not an issue. Yeah, but you
Mhm.
mentioned something, and I prepared as well this question, but for the end of our today's interview. However, I will ask it right now because you already mentioned it.
Mhm.
Event sourcing versus event streaming.
Mhm.
Why they are so often confused?
Yeah, so definitely the first thing is the naming stuff, which is hard. And we have too many events on the dance floor. So we have event storming, event streaming, event sourcing, event driven, and probably more stuff like that. So that can be confusing, especially if you are entering the space. So those names sound extremely similar. So if you're new, then it's totally fine not to get the idea. But as we discussed and as we mentioned, even sourcing is about the quality of your data. So about the quality in the sense about the how precise information you keep in your database. So it's about how to record the events in the best way, and then use them to make next decision. And also, even sourcing can be a first step, an enabler for other integrations, because as I mentioned, even stores can publish some notifications that you had the event. And this part looks really, really similar to, for instance, how Kafka, Pulsar, or NATS are used, because
Mhm.
they are about integration. But I would say that uh, event sourcing, as we mentioned, is like a storage pattern. So it's about the quality of data and durable storing of those facts. And even streaming is about putting them into motion. So integrating different services, triggering some processes in other places. So that sounds really similar, but it's much different, because then those tools are optimized for a different thing. So event stores are optimized for durability and consistency,
Mhm.
and streaming solutions are optimized for throughput. And as
Mhm.
we know, like, you cannot have all. It's just impossible, like in a even from the cap theorem. So either you have a good throughput or you have a good consistency. There is nothing in between. So even streaming solution like Kafka, Pulsar, they are about publishing your information and subscribing to them and doing stuff about it. Also doing some transformations of events, etc. And those tools, so event sourcing, event stores, and streaming solutions can work pretty well with each other, because if you record those granular events, then you can use them to also integrate that with different systems. But so maybe half joking, but it's the same difference as between Postgres and RabbitMQ. It's like that. It's just the same difference in the same category. Can you do queuing on Postgres? Of course, you can do everything on Postgres, but is it the tool for that? It's not. In Rabbit, can you store durable? I heard that right now you can also do it, but no, it's
I think since a month or so.
Yeah.
But still, it's not. This is what you just told. It's not a tool. So just select a correct tool for your problem. And I think this is very important here. What you mentioned about this durability and the throughput exchange. So I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, so of course those tools can do both, a bit of both. Like I mentioned, event stores can publish notification. Event streaming solutions like Kafka have in theory like infinite storage, so it doesn't have like a top size that you can put there. But I am always looking at the tooling when I am evaluate that and the features, whether it's a first-class citizen feature or was just added because user asked for that. So we just added just for more like a marketing or to enable some specific cases, but not like a main goal of this tool. So I fully agree what you said about using the right tool for the job.
And another question, because this is as well quite often in pair, event sourcing and CQRS. We are talking here about this read models, write models. There is as well a lot of confusion about CQRS itself, but how they two relate to each other. Can event sourcing live without CQRS?
So maybe I will first start with explaining the acronym, the CQRS. So it's a command query responsibility segregation. So it means that we are not only separating, like in a CQS, our flows and requests and operation based on the business logic and the business processes, but also we are segregating logically, because CQRS is a logical split, about logical split. So we are separating a business logic, so command handling, so intention to run some business logic, from querying. And that's all. In theory, we could use the same database, even a single table, and that would be perfectly fine CQRS, as long as we wouldn't modify and read at the same time. I mean, return the data at the same time. So in event sourcing, definitely you can use CQRS without event sourcing. And that's something that would be perfectly fine. I wouldn't start immediately thinking about event sourcing when I'm doing CQRS. You can do with any type of storage, because CQRS is not about storage. It's not about multiple databases. It's about logical segregation and separation. And in event sourcing,
just let me just put something here, because you mentioned it doesn't matter from the storage perspective. And guys, this is exactly this. You can even store it in text file. You can store data in text file and read it from the text file. That's not a problem at all. And you will be doing the CQRS stuff because this is this logical separation, not based on the type of a storage or something like that.
Or you might even not store anything at all, because your command handling will be just a pass through, like calling other service, right? So
Yeah.
It might you might not even have any state in your system if you're just integrating services.
Yeah. And sorry because I interrupted you, so you can now
No
continue.
worries.
Event sourcing.
Yes, I told you I have tendencies to talk too much, so I appreciate that you stopping me. I think that it's for good for listeners and for viewers. So yeah, so now the question is, can you use event sourcing without CQRS? And in theory, you can, because as we agreed, you can do like in-memory read models, and you can return the database built from events and append new events at the same time. But I would say that it would be far from ergonomic and a good developer experience if you do it like that, because then to be able to capture and those granular events and the precise business information, you know the precise business intention. Because if you have a command that is named update reservation, then what type of event can you store? Probably just reservation updated. And as you said, it's no value for neither for developers nor for users. It would be just bikes heading if we try to use event sourcing and just store that type of events. So I would say that CQRS goes really well with event sourcing. I'm joking that it's like tequila, salt, and citron. They go pretty well with each other, but you don't need to use them together. It's fine not to do it. I I would say that I'm not in the team where I would say that you have to use event sourcing for everything. I would say that be selective if in where you use it, where it would. I think that you can use it everywhere, but if you have already the skills, there is no additional overhead if you know it already. But it might not add a lot of additional value comparing to the approach you have, which might be good enough. But for CQRS, I would say that I don't see any reason why not to use CQRS in the sense as we discussed. So separating and focusing on slicing our process by the business intentions, because if we apply that, for example, on the API level, and we already thinking like what to expose and how to run, what business processes we need to fulfill, then in the implementation detail, it might be CRUD. We might use ORM, whatever is useful for us. But as long as we are already starting to segregate that, then for me, using CQRS is something that I would really strongly recommend. I see a lot of reluctance from people, but
until they first use it.
Yeah, especially that. How can you tell, like, yeah, but I don't want to do this CQRS? Like, for me, when I hear that stuff, it's like, well, I don't want to know what I'm coding. What is the business logic behind it? I don't care about that. It's for me, it's like almost the same, because if we think about CQRS just as a logical split in terms of separating your business flows, then what's the issue with that? I don't see an issue with that.
Okay. Yeah, I fully agree with you. So in general, guys, when you want to run CQRS without event sourcing, that's fine.
Yep.
When you want to run event sourcing without CQRS, possible, but why should you do that?
Yeah, fully agree. Nice summary.
Cool. And do you remember a situation where event sourcing saved you and your team? I mean, like, hey, if we had not implemented it, we would have been screwed.
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that I had such case where I thought that we would be screwed if we didn't use event sourcing, but definitely I had scenarios where I felt that my life was much easier than if I didn't use event sourcing. So the example of that was that, for instance, if you are using messaging systems and the messaging or streaming, so solution that is, as we agreed, about moving data, integrating services, then those tooling have their own retention policy that you should apply to those messages. And in my system, not all modules were even sourced. And then it appeared that, I mean, we were quite early, and the team on the other module didn't know that Kafka has a default retention policy. I'm not sure what this is not right now, but at that time it was 2 weeks. And then they wanted to reprocess the read models or even republish the messages to retrigger the business flows because they found some error, and they realized that they don't have this information, they don't have those events anymore. And for me it was like, okay, cool, then I will just republish my events from event store and call it a day. I mean, it's not always that easy because you might have so many events that it will take weeks to reprocess that, but at least you have those options. And the other thing was, definitely, I'm always, when I'm talking with the dev people, then it's really useful to solve the things that we don't want, some bugs. So if we get bug, and it's really easy to trace what was the issue, because you can take events, of course, if you have access to that. But if it's like a serious case, then probably you might get some at least anonymized data. And then you can take those events and you literally can debug that part even in your IDE, write a super easy test based on that. So tracking those issues and the tracing, it was really easy. And the third thing is that when business comes with the new ideas, and like for instance, new views, new read models, and typically you would need to think like, okay, so how do I migrate? How do I get those information from my already existing data and connect it together? Because you just have the latest state. But if you have events, and if you have already this information to build those new features in place, because let's say that it didn't require to put additional data, then it's that easy. You just write a new projection, use the events that you have, fill it in the data, and that's all. That's it. Or if you head back with the read model, then you, in the worst case, you can even erase it and rebuild it. So I think that those cases were the one that I would say that helped me a lot, and I felt that it's great that I had event sourcing in place. But I don't know if I had the, probably not, that I would say that, yeah, okay, I wouldn't be able to fix it if I didn't have, I mean, like, if I didn't have event sourcing.
I remember that I once read about some situation that guys had audit. I think it was a public organization, and they had an audit, and they recorded all these events that were happening with some kind of object. I don't know. I don't remember what was this object, but they said that if they would have not have it, like this event recorded, then they would have a lot of problems, and they didn't know when they were just deciding for it, they didn't know that it will be useful in such case in future, and it was just a coincidence that they decided for event sourcing and they had it. So I think in such cases it might help you.
Yeah, definitely. I heard a few cases where even initially they didn't think that they will have a really like an audit. Sometimes you have just control, unexpected control, because legal stuff. And I heard a few times that it was so easy because you just show it like, yeah, here you have it. So how can you prove me that this data wasn't modified, that no one can do the random update? Then it's also easy to prove it because you just show it, like especially if you use a solution like even store DB, because then in if you have Marten and Postgres, then someone can always modify that. Of course, you might show that it's not possible from the application standpoint, but someone could do it. But in the event store, it's also technically possible, but you would need to modify raw bytes. So probably you wouldn't like to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Cool. And I'm curious about your story in event sourcing. Like, what were the biggest challenges you faced while implementing event sourcing?
So I think that always the biggest issue are humans. Most of the
Now I don't know if I can publish it to YouTube.
sorry. So yeah, I think that as you even said, we have the tendency as people to, especially in our industry, to overcomplicate stuff and or focus on the technicalities instead of the modeling. So if you're doing event sourcing, then it's not that hard. I would say it's really easy pattern by itself, but you need to have the ramp up time. You need to change your mindset a bit, and also to unlearn a few stuff, and that's not easy because people are too often just transferring their habits and their approach into the other pattern. And as with any storage patterns, you need to learn the specifics and to use it correctly. So for instance, in relational database, you have data normalization. In document base, you have denormalization, and in event sourcing, you have keeping streams short. So modeling and focusing on the business processes. So it's like in any storage pattern, it's requires learning curve, getting some practice in that. But it's not much different than you would try to use other tool. Like it all requires some learning curve. But most often, some people are so stuck in like some people in the team prefer to do it this way because they see the benefits, but maybe they are not skilled enough to explain other members why is it so important and what are the benefits. Or maybe those other people are just against that because no reason. And then it's a easy thing to um, to get the miscommunication issues, etc. So I would start with that. Sometimes even if you have a good matching, like I was helping one of our Polish banks, not the biggest one, but small one, but no name mentioned, and like they. So in theory, accounting is a perfect match for event sourcing, but they like didn't have any skills in place. So it's good that they reached for help for some workshops, etc. But I even could tell which articles they read looking at the design, because they made all those weird design decisions that you can find on internet. And this is not an issue. Like we all do mistakes, but if you are on the Dunning-Kruger peak, then and you are reluctant to learn and just change your way of thinking, then you will have a hard time. So definitely that's something that I would say that it's the biggest challenge in general, because other things can be solved if you have a good team and if you have people that are motivated to learn, and if you reach for help, then that's fine. But from purely event sourcing perspective, then I would say that besides the focusing on the nouns instead of verbs, so for instance, instead of selecting the processes and building, like for instead of keeping all the stream for reservation, then maybe guest reservation and whole handling the guest life cycle, then maybe we could split it up and even have like a reservation tentative reservation creation, a different stream, checkout process, a different stream. So focusing on the processes, that's something that you need to unlearn from the traditional way, because then you are thinking about the entities. You immediately think about tables, etc. And in event sourcing, it's really totally fine to denormalize your approach or your thinking and purely focus on processes you have. Then it would be much more efficient. And a common mistake that we all do, I think that I touched a bit about that already, but not thinking about events as an API. And if you don't think about it and you republish all the events outside, then it's also a recipe for disaster. Because quite often people are thinking, well, okay, I have those events, so I will just republish them to some messaging system, let's say our topic. We already need to do it because we have our read models or our few services run by our team. Then let's tell the other teams to just subscribe to that. And that's an issue, because then the other teams need to understand all those granular events and all the nitty-gritty of your process. And at the beginning, it might be sounds like a good move for the team producing those events because they don't need to do additional work. But then when people subscribe to those events, then they have much more work, because if they want to provide a breaking change or just update the events, then they add new events, then they always need to think that someone may be listening for them, and always need to be much more careful, and always much more just in the end they spend much more time and doing just in case procedures, just in case someone listened to that. So better approach is to break your events into two groups and calling that internal and external. Nicktoon is calling that private and public, and DDD community is calling that domain events and integration events, which I don't like this name. I think that more explicit are those public, private, or internal, external, because if we're thinking about the event storming terminology, then those granular one are like from the process level. So they are representing the knowledge of your specific module business domain. So they are understandable in the inside the context of your module. So that's why I'm calling them internal. And you external events, they are still events, and they should also be following the same practices as the other, but they are usually a bit bigger because they represent events that are understandable from the perspective of the whole system.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So that's I would say plus snapshots, of course, but we discussed that. So I would say that those are the biggest issues, and the issues that are the hardest to rewind. So those are the issues that are the hardest to rewind, because there are also other stuff, but they are not so critical, I would say.
There is one challenge which was mentioned. This is the first question that we got, and this is about handling schema changes and schema evolution in event sourcing. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say, I mean, it's a challenge, but I wouldn't say that it's extremely sophisticated if you are following a few practices. So let's start maybe with a lame joke, as always. So the best way to version your schema is to not have to version it. And so I have a strict rule. I'm usually a lot about it depends, etc. And I'm quite flexible. But in terms of contracts and messaging, and in general, working between teams, is not do breaking changes. That's a policy that I recommend to apply, because then handling that, it's much easier. People try to think that if they do breaking change, then that will be quicker. So that will be quicker in the local scope of the specific change, and only taking into an account what you did in this specific Jira ticket, whatever. But in the long term, and if you add to that other teams will need to rethink it, you will need to rethink it, as we discussed, then doing breaking changes is always, I would say, devastating for the development process, especially around events. So if you have events, and let's say that you're following no breaking change policy, then you have you have set of simple patterns that can take you pretty far. And if you're using like serializers, then if you're adding new field, then technically it's not a breaking change. It might be a breaking change if it's essential field for your business process. But if you already didn't have this field and you run your system and it survive, then that means that you can somehow handle that. And so I think that using weak schema, so like a JSON where you can append and deserialize it, it's totally fine. Because if you are in general for events, the steps that you need to do, they are not different than if you're doing changes to your database schema. Like let's say that you are adding new column into the table, then you need to, if it's nullable, you can do it probably, nothing will be broken. If you're adding required, so not nullable column, then you need to think like, can I provide this data somehow? Or can I provide a default? Or can I, how to get the default? Can I get it from the current data? Or I need to assume some constant value? So in event sourcing, in events, it's not much different, because if you do it, then for instance, you can assume that if you updated your code and you still have the old events, then you can use the defaults for those old events that don't have this information. But and that's not super hard. Of course, the tricky part is like renames of the properties. Don't do it. Or if you really need to do it, then serializers in Java and C# provide some mappings, etc. And you can also plug in some transformation functions that are called upcasters. So it's like you either take the old payload, like a raw payload, or deserialize all payload and transform it into the new format. So those are really easy patterns that can take you pretty far. But the best pattern to end up with the lame joke that I started is how to do it that you don't need to do this versioning so much. That pattern is that you technically should apply some archiving strategies. Because let's say that you are adding new data format and you are providing format that is compatible with the old version, with a new version. You can do it. That's always possible. And then most of the time, entities are not living for a long time. Like support tickets, they are living like a few days, or shopping carts, a few hours, maybe at most. And most of the entities in our systems are having rather short lifetime. And if they have long lifetime, then maybe we can model that differently. So for instance, instead of the whole account, then the counting month. And when you embrace those temporal aspect of events streams and your business processes, then you can, if you don't want to deal with those old payloads, then at some point you can just delete those old events. I mean, maybe not delete, archive, so move it somewhere else. But if you know that you won't need and you won't use this data anymore because those streams represents deleted or canceled or closed or confirmed data, then why to keep it in your database? The fact that even sourcing you are not losing business data doesn't mean that you need to keep it all at one place, right? So there are plenty of options. I recommend also reading the Greg Young's books about event versioning. It's a I wouldn't say that it's a book about versioning, even about the title. It's a book about the challenges that you might be facing in the distributed systems. And this book might be quite scary, but it provides a really complete overview what you can do. But those simple patterns that I mentioned, together with no breaking policy, like should take you really, really far. And one last sentence about that is, I think that people are having issues with with versioning is that you see that your stream has issues, like you have a bug in your stream, because you see that, because you have this data, right? So you can look on the event and point it like, hey, this is the place where it's broken. But if you have your row in relational database, then you just don't know it. It might be equally broken. If you keep those data in relational database, then it would be equally broken, but you wouldn't have those tools to reason and to even see that this data is broken unless someone noticed that and send it back. So,
guys, I just put this link to the book from Greg Young in comments. If you can't see it, it will be for sure in the description of this interview on YouTube, so you will be able to find it. And well, Oskar, I think we came to the end of today's live interview. I would like to thank you for this ocean of knowledge on event sourcing. I hope that we will help a lot of people who are starting their journey in event sourcing to just not to make these mistakes that we discussed, to not to think that event sourcing is really complex, because in fact it is not, what we learned today from you.
I mean, it might be complicated, but it's not complex necessarily. Yeah.
Thank you again. And I have one announcement for you guys. On April 25th, a new series on this channel will appear, and it will be hosted by Radek Maziarka.
Nice.
Once in a month, in each episode, Radek will focus on one selected book on the topic of tech leadership, architecture, or engineering in general, and he will describe what is this book about and so on. This is based on the feedback that we got from you while having the interview with him last month.
Nice.
Yeah, and the third guest for live interviews is already confirmed for May. So stay tuned and see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you for those who join and those who watching the recording, and Fuad, Martin, and Kamil for your questions and comments, and of course for Maciek for your invitation. It was a pleasure.
As always, pleasure on my side. Good. Thank you very much, and see you guys.
Thank you. Bye.